Society has a problem with truth-tellers, but there's one type that terrifies the establishment more than any whistleblower, investigative journalist, or political activist. It's the awakened empath, someone who's learned to see through the collective illusions that keep our social systems functioning. What I'm about to reveal will show you why these individuals represent the greatest threat to societal deception. Jung spent years studying what he called collective unconscious participation, how most people unconsciously agree to maintain social lies for the sake of group harmony. But empaths, who've awakened to their true nature, become immune to this psychological programming. They see the emperor's nakedness when everyone else is admiring his clothes, and they're no longer willing to pretend otherwise. Here's what makes this so dangerous for society. Awakened empaths don't just see individual deceptions, they perceive entire systems of organized dishonesty. They recognize how families maintain dysfunction through shared denial, how workplaces exploit emotional labor while pretending to care about employee well-being, how social institutions manipulate empathy to maintain control over those they claim to serve. Let me share what Jung discovered about this phenomenon. He worked with a patient who had always been the family truth-teller, the one who pointed out uncomfortable realities that others preferred to ignore. Initially, this person's family dismissed their observations as oversensitivity or negativity. But as this individual developed what Jung called awakened perception, their ability to see through social facades became undeniable. This patient began recognizing patterns that others couldn't or wouldn't see. They noticed how their workplace preached work-life balance, while systematically punishing anyone who actually maintained boundaries. They observed how their family claimed to value honesty while consistently rewarding those who told comfortable lies. They saw how their social circle talked about authenticity while ostracizing anyone who expressed genuine vulnerability. Jung realized this wasn't paranoia or cynicism. It was enhanced pattern recognition that comes from integrating both empathetic sensitivity and protective discernment. The awakened empath develops what he termed systemic sight, the ability to see how interconnected deceptions function to maintain dysfunctional status quos. The psychological mechanics behind this transformation are fascinating. Empaths naturally absorb emotional information from their environment, but when they awaken to their own patterns, they stop internalizing others' emotions and start analyzing them objectively. This creates a shift from feeling the collective mood to observing the collective manipulation. They begin to notice how guilt is weaponized to maintain compliance, how shame is used to prevent authentic expression, how fear is cultivated to discourage questioning authority. They see through the emotional manipulation that keeps dysfunctional systems operating smoothly, and they become increasingly unwilling to participate in maintaining these illusions. Jung documented how this patient's truth-telling became increasingly precise and undeniable. They didn't make vague accusations or emotional outbursts. They pointed out specific contradictions between stated values and actual behaviors. They highlighted the gap between public personas and private actions. They exposed the mechanisms through which groups maintained collective denial about obvious problems. What made this so threatening was the awakened empath's ability to speak truths that everyone knew but no one was supposed to acknowledge. They became living reminders of the compromises others had made with their own integrity. Their presence made it impossible for groups to maintain comfortable delusions about their own dysfunction. Real talk. I've got to tell you something that most psychology content won't touch. We're not just talking about someone being honest. We're talking about someone who can see through the fundamental lies that hold our social structures together. If you're recognizing this pattern in yourself or someone you know, comment Truth Seeker below. Because what I'm about to reveal next will show you exactly why society works so hard to silence these individuals. The awakened empath becomes what Jung called a collective shadow revealer, someone who reflects back the parts of group identity that the collective has disowned. When a family prides itself on being close-knit, the awakened empath points out the emotional distance and superficial connections. When a workplace markets itself as innovative, the awakened empath highlights the rigid conformity and fear of real change. This truth-telling isn't malicious, it's compulsive. Once an empath awakens to systemic deception, they lose the ability to participate in maintaining lies, even comfortable ones. They can't pretend toxic behavior is acceptable. They can't ignore obvious hypocrisy, and they can't perform the emotional labor required to keep dysfunctional systems running smoothly. Jung observed 3 distinct phases of this awakening process. First, the recognition phase, where the empath begins to see patterns they'd previously internalized as normal. They start noticing how their emotional needs have been consistently minimized while others' needs were prioritized. They recognize how their truth-telling has been labeled as negativity or oversensitivity. Second, the integration phase, where the empath stops taking responsibility for others' emotional reactions to truth. They realize that people's discomfort with reality isn't their problem to manage. They understand that being liked isn't worth maintaining lies, and they begin speaking authentic observations, regardless of how others respond. Third, the embodiment phase, where the awakened empath becomes a living example of authentic existence. They stop performing roles that require them to deny obvious realities. They become unable to engage in small talk that maintains surface-level connections while avoiding substantial truth. They lose interest in relationships that require them to diminish their perceptive abilities. This transformation creates what Jung termed collective cognitive dissonance. Groups that encounter awakened empaths are forced to confront the contradictions in their own systems. They can either evolve toward greater authenticity or work to eliminate the source of uncomfortable truth-telling. Most choose elimination. The social mechanisms for silencing awakened empaths are sophisticated and predictable. First comes gaslighting, convincing the truth-teller that their perceptions are incorrect or exaggerated. When that fails, there's isolation, excluding them from social groups and family dynamics. Finally, there's character assassination, labeling them as negative, toxic, or mentally unstable. Jung recognized this pattern as collective shadow projection. The group projects their own disowned darkness onto the truth-teller to avoid facing their own complicity in maintaining dysfunction. The awakened empath becomes the scapegoat for everyone else's unacknowledged dishonesty. Consider the workplace awakened empath who points out that the company's diversity initiatives are performative theater, while actual promotion practices remain discriminatory. They notice how management talks about employee mental health while creating policies that guarantee burnout. They observe how the organization preaches collaboration while rewarding those who undermine teammates. When they speak these truths, they're not attacking individuals, they're exposing systems. But because most people are psychologically invested in believing their workplace is ethical, the truth-teller becomes the problem. They're labeled as negative, ungrateful, or not a team player. The focus shifts from examining the valid concerns to managing the troublesome employee. The awakened workplace empath sees through corporate doublespeak with laser precision. They notice how work-life balance actually means being available 24/7 while pretending it's voluntary. They observe how family culture translates to emotional manipulation designed to extract unpaid overtime. They recognize how performance improvement plans are really elaborate documentation processes for predetermined terminations. Their pattern recognition extends to office politics and power dynamics. They see how certain employees get credit for collaborative work while others do the actual labor. They notice how feedback flows upward as praise but downward as criticism. They observe how workplace conflicts are consistently resolved in favor of those with more political capital rather than those with valid concerns. When they attempt to address these systemic issues, they encounter what Jung called institutional gaslighting. Their observations are reframed as attitude problems, their documentation is dismissed as nitpicking, and their requests for accountability are labeled as insubordination. The workplace transforms them from valued team member to problematic employee, simply for refusing to participate in collective denial. The awakened workplace empath recognizes how corporate culture weaponizes empathy. They see how companies use employee assistance programs to shift responsibility for systemic stress onto individual resilience. They notice how team-building exercises serve to create artificial intimacy that makes it harder to maintain professional boundaries. They understand how open office concepts are sold as collaboration, but actually eliminate privacy and increase surveillance. Jung's research revealed that workplace awakened empaths often become what he termed organizational canaries. Their declining well-being signals toxic environmental conditions, that affect everyone but are only acknowledged by the most sensitive. When they begin withdrawing their emotional labor, entire departments discover how dependent they'd become on one person's unpaid psychological maintenance. Or think about the family-awakened empath who refuses to participate in holiday traditions that require pretending abusive relatives have changed. They won't engage in conversations that maintain family myths about being loving and supportive when the actual dynamics are competitive and conditional. They stop performing the emotional labor that allows family dysfunction to appear normal. Their truth-telling forces family members to confront the gap between their self-image and their actual behavior. Rather than face this uncomfortable reality, the family typically works to marginalize the truth-teller. They're excluded from gatherings, their concerns are minimized, and they're blamed for causing drama by refusing to maintain comfortable lies. The family-awakened empath recognizes generational patterns that others refuse to acknowledge. They see how trauma gets passed down through normalized dysfunction, how emotional neglect gets disguised as building character, how conditional love gets presented as having high standards. They understand how family roles become psychological prisons that prevent authentic relationships from developing. When they attempt to discuss these patterns, they encounter fierce resistance. Family members who've built their identities around being good parents or close siblings become defensive when confronted with evidence that contradicts these self-concepts. The awakened empath's presence threatens the carefully constructed family mythology that allows everyone to avoid taking responsibility for their relational choices. Jung observed that family-awakened empaths often serve as what he called intergenerational pattern breakers. They're the first in their lineage to refuse participating in transmitted trauma. This makes them incredibly valuable for future generations, but often results in their being scapegoated by current family members who aren't ready to examine their own unconscious perpetuation of harmful dynamics. The family system responds to their awakening with what Jung termed homeostatic resistance, unconscious pressure to return to previous patterns that felt stable, even if they were dysfunctional. Family members may become more demanding, more critical, or more manipulative in attempts to restore the awakened empath to their former role as emotional caretaker and system stabilizer. Most devastating is the romantic awakened empath, who can see through their partner's performance of being a loving, committed person. They notice the pattern of promises without follow-through, grand gestures without consistent daily kindness, public displays of affection without private emotional intimacy. They recognize when someone is performing the role of a good partner without actually being one. When they speak these truths, they're often accused of being impossible to please, overly critical, or expecting perfection. The focus becomes their unrealistic standards rather than their partner's inability to align actions with stated values. Society reinforces this gaslighting because acknowledging the truth would require admitting how many relationships are built on mutual performance rather than authentic connection. The romantic awakened empath develops what Jung termed authenticity radar. They can sense when someone is performing love rather than feeling it. They notice when affection is strategic rather than spontaneous, when kindness is calculated rather than genuine, when commitment is verbal rather than behavioral. This perceptive ability makes them incredible partners for those seeking genuine connection, but it makes them impossible to manipulate through emotional performance. Jung's work with couples revealed that romantic awakened empaths often expose what he called relational theater, the elaborate performances that pass for intimate connection in many relationships. They recognize when couples are performing happiness for social media while privately struggling with basic communication. They see when romantic gestures are designed to avoid addressing underlying relationship problems rather than express genuine affection. The awakened romantic empath becomes unable to participate in what Jung termed mutual enabling relationships, partnerships where both people agree to overlook each other's dysfunction in exchange for companionship. They lose interest in relationships that require them to minimize their needs, ignore red flags, or pretend problems don't exist for the sake of maintaining artificial harmony. Here's what I need you to understand. Awakened empaths aren't trying to destroy social harmony. They're trying to create authentic harmony based on truth rather than shared delusion. But because our social systems depend on collective participation in comfortable lies, truth-telling feels like an existential threat. Jung's research revealed that awakened empaths often experience what he called social exile syndrome. a sense of being fundamentally incompatible with the unconscious agreements that govern group behavior. They find themselves increasingly isolated, not because they're difficult people, but because they can't participate in the emotional dishonesty that most social connections require. The awakened empath develops what Jung termed transparency vision. They can see through social masks to the authentic person underneath. This makes them incredibly valuable friends and partners for those seeking genuine connection, but it makes them dangerous to those whose entire social identity depends on maintaining a false persona. They notice when someone's words don't match their energy, when stated values contradict actual choices, when public behavior differs from private character. This perceptive ability makes them natural lie detectors, but it also makes them social threats to anyone living inauthentically. Society has developed sophisticated methods for neutralizing these truth-tellers. Professional environments label them as lacking emotional intelligence when they refuse to pretend workplace dysfunction is normal. Families accuse them of being ungrateful when they won't participate in maintaining toxic dynamics. Social groups exclude them for being too intense when they can't engage in superficial connections. The psychological pressure to conform is enormous. Awakened empaths are constantly told they're too sensitive, too negative, too demanding, too honest. They're encouraged to lower their standards, accept less than they deserve, and stop expecting others to align actions with stated values. The message is clear. Your perception is the problem, not the reality you're perceiving. But Jung observed something remarkable about those who resist this pressure. They develop what he called authentic magnetism, the ability to attract others who are also seeking genuine connection and honest communication. They become beacons for other awakened individuals who've grown tired of maintaining social lies. This creates what Jung termed authenticity clusters, small groups of people who've rejected collective participation in comfortable deceptions. These connections are incredibly rare, but extraordinarily nourishing, because they're based on mutual truth-telling rather than mutual performance. The awakened empath learns to value quality over quantity in relationships. They'd rather have 3 authentic connections than 30 superficial ones. They'd rather be alone than pretend toxic behavior is acceptable. They'd rather be misunderstood than compromise their perception of reality. Jung's work revealed that awakened empaths often go through what he called the authenticity purge, a period where they systematically remove relationships and commitments that require them to deny their perceptions or diminish their truth-telling abilities. This process can appear destructive from the outside, but it's actually essential psychological housekeeping. During this purge, they stop attending social events that feel performative. They withdraw from family dynamics that require emotional dishonesty. They end romantic relationships built on mutual accommodation rather than mutual appreciation. They quit jobs that demand they ignore obvious ethical violations. They leave social groups that punish authentic expression. They distance themselves from friends who only want surface-level connection. This process creates what Jung termed authentic space, psychological and social room for genuine connections to develop. The awakened empath discovers that removing inauthentic relationships doesn't leave them isolated. It creates capacity for the deep, reciprocal connections they'd always craved, but never had space to cultivate. Jung documented how this purge often triggers what he called social system collapse, multiple dysfunctional systems simultaneously losing their primary emotional maintenance worker. Families experience increased conflict without their mediator, workplaces struggle with morale without their emotional stabilizer, and friend groups fragment without their social coordinator. The awakened empath watches these collapses with what Jung termed compassionate detachment. They feel empathy for others' struggles, but refuse to resume roles that require them to sacrifice their authenticity. They understand that short-term social disruption often leads to long-term systemic health if people are willing to do their own emotional work. Between you and me, watching someone complete this awakening process is like witnessing a psychological miracle. They stop betraying themselves to maintain others' comfort, and they start living from a place of absolute authenticity. The awakened empath becomes what Jung called a living truth detector in social situations. They can sense when someone is performing emotions they don't feel, when groups are maintaining shared delusions, when leaders are manipulating followers through manufactured crises or false promises. Their presence makes it impossible for others to maintain comfortable self-deceptions. In social gatherings, They notice when conversations are designed to avoid substantial topics, when humor is used to deflect from uncomfortable truths, when politeness serves to maintain harmful status quos. They can't participate in small talk that serves no purpose other than avoiding authentic connection, and they struggle with social rituals that feel empty or performative. Their truth-telling extends beyond verbal communication. Their authentic presence challenges others to examine their own level of genuineness. People around awakened empaths often report feeling simultaneously drawn to their authenticity and threatened by their unwillingness to participate in collective pretense. Jung documented how awakened empaths often become what he termed catalysts for collective shadow work. Their presence forces groups to confront the aspects of themselves they've been avoiding. This makes them powerful agents of social evolution, but it also makes them targets for elimination by systems that depend on collective unconsciousness. The awakened empath develops what Jung called systemic pattern recognition. They can see how individual behaviors connect to larger cultural patterns. They recognize how personal struggles often reflect societal dysfunction, how individual healing requires challenging collective assumptions, how authentic living threatens systems built on mass conformity. This recognition extends to political and cultural systems. They see through manufactured outrage designed to distract from substantive issues. They recognize how social movements get co-opted by the very systems they claim to challenge. They understand how consumer culture weaponizes insecurity to drive endless consumption. They notice how entertainment industries promote values that benefit corporate interests rather than human well-being. Share this with someone who's struggling to understand why they feel so incompatible with social expectations. Because most people don't realize that what they're experiencing isn't a personal failing. It's a sign of psychological awakening. The framework Jung developed for understanding this phenomenon centers on what he called collective versus individual consciousness. Most people operate from collective consciousness. They unconsciously agree to see reality through the group's lens, accept the group's values, and maintain the group's illusions. This creates social cohesion, but requires sacrificing individual perception and authentic expression. Awakened empaths operate from individual consciousness. They see reality through their own perceptive lens, hold their own values, and refuse to maintain illusions that contradict their direct experience. This creates psychological integrity, but often results in social isolation. Jung believed this awakening was a natural part of human psychological development, but that most people never complete the process because the social pressure to remain unconsciously conforming is too intense. Those who do complete the awakening become what he called individuated beings, people who've integrated their own psychological wholeness rather than defining themselves through group membership. The awakened empath represents the fully individuated person who can no longer sacrifice their authentic perception for social acceptance. They've developed what Jung termed integrated discrimination, the ability to discern truth from illusion, authenticity from performance, genuine care from manipulative kindness. This discrimination becomes so refined that they can instantly recognize others operating from the same level of consciousness. They're drawn to authentic people and repelled by those maintaining false personas. They can sense manipulation before it's consciously attempted and withdraw from relationships that require them to diminish their perceptive abilities. Jung's research revealed that awakened empaths develop what he called systemic immunity. They become resistant to the psychological manipulation techniques that work on most people. They can't be guilted into maintaining toxic relationships. They can't be shamed into accepting less than they deserve. And they can't be frightened into compromising their authentic expression. This immunity extends to institutional manipulation as well. They see through corporate culture initiatives designed to extract more labor while providing fewer benefits. They recognize political rhetoric designed to manipulate emotions rather than address substantive issues. They understand how religious or spiritual leaders use guilt and fear to maintain control over followers. The social threat they represent is profound because they make unconscious living impossible for those around them. Their presence forces others to either awaken to their own authenticity or work actively to maintain their illusions. Most choose the latter, which requires eliminating or marginalizing the source of uncomfortable truth. Jung documented how societies throughout history have dealt with their truth-tellers through exile, persecution, or attempts to discredit their perceptions. The awakened empath faces modern versions of these same social mechanisms, but their response is different from historical truth-tellers. They don't seek martyrdom or try to force others to see reality. They simply withdraw their participation from systems that require them to deny obvious truths. This withdrawal is what makes them so dangerous to dysfunctional systems. They don't attack or rebel. They simply stop supporting structures that depend on collective denial. They refuse to provide emotional labor that maintains toxic dynamics. They won't perform roles that require them to pretend dysfunction is normal. The awakened empath becomes what Jung called a systemic non-participant, someone who recognizes the game but chooses not to play. This non-participation exposes how much dysfunctional systems depend on unconscious cooperation from those they exploit. When enough awakened empaths withdraw their support from dysfunctional systems, those systems begin to collapse. This is why they represent such a threat to established structures that depend on empathetic people continuing to provide unpaid emotional labor while accepting minimal reciprocity. The awakened empath has learned the ultimate truth that society doesn't want empaths to discover. Their empathy is incredibly valuable, and they have every right to be selective about who receives it. They understand that giving their emotional gifts to those who don't reciprocate isn't kindness. It's enabling dysfunction while depleting themselves. This realization transforms them from society's emotional servants into sovereign beings who choose their connections based on mutual respect rather than perceived need. They become dangerous because they model what authentic empathic living looks like when it's not being exploited by those who take more than they give. Jung's final observations about awakened empaths revealed their ultimate psychological achievement. They become what he called integrated truth-tellers, people who can speak difficult truths from a place of love rather than anger, clarity rather than reactivity, wisdom rather than criticism. Their truth-telling becomes surgical rather than destructive, precise rather than overwhelming. They learn to calibrate their honesty based on others' capacity to receive truth. They don't waste energy trying to awaken those who are committed to remaining unconscious, but they become incredibly generous with those who demonstrate genuine willingness to face reality. They develop discernment about when truth-telling serves healing and when it serves their own emotional needs. This integration allows them to maintain their authentic perception while building genuine connections with others who share their commitment to living consciously. They become what Jung termed authenticity ambassadors, living examples of what human relationships can become when they're based on mutual truth rather than mutual performance. The awakened empath ultimately develops what Jung called conscious compassion, empathy that's informed by wisdom rather than driven by compulsion. They can feel others' pain without absorbing it, recognize others' potential without rescuing them, and offer support without enabling dependency. This conscious compassion makes them incredibly powerful healers and teachers for those ready to do their own psychological work. Look, I just shared insights that challenge fundamental assumptions about how empaths should function in society. This isn't about becoming cold or uncaring. It's about becoming discerning and self-respecting. If you're an empath who's awakening to these realizations, understand that your discomfort with social expectations isn't a personal problem. It's a sign of psychological health. You're not too sensitive or too demanding. You're becoming too authentic for systems that depend on your unconscious participation in maintaining comfortable lives. And here's what I want you to do right now. Trust your perceptions, even when others tell you they're wrong. Honor your truth, even when it makes others uncomfortable. Choose relationships that celebrate your authenticity rather than trying to diminish it. Because the world needs awakened empaths who refuse to participate in collective denial. You're not society's problem, you're society's solution. You represent the possibility of authentic human connection in a world addicted to comfortable illusions, and that makes you the most dangerous truth-teller of all. Your awakening isn't just personal healing, it's a contribution to collective evolution toward greater authenticity and genuine human connection. Every relationship you refuse to fake, every truth you speak with love, every boundary you maintain with grace is helping to create a world where authenticity becomes normal rather than threatening. Look, what we just explored together isn't just psychological theory. It's your roadmap to authentic living in a world that profits from your conformity. You've just absorbed years of research that most people will never encounter, and that puts you in an incredibly rare position. Right now, thousands of empaths are sitting in their cars after work, feeling that familiar exhaustion that comes from giving their emotional energy to systems that don't reciprocate. They're scrolling through content that tells them to just set boundaries without understanding the psychological warfare they're actually facing. Meanwhile, you now possess the deep knowledge that explains exactly why their truth-telling threatens the very foundations of social dysfunction. This moment matters because you're part of a small group of people who refuse to accept surface-level explanations for complex psychological phenomena. You understand that awakened empaths aren't just difficult people. They're evolutionary catalysts forcing humanity toward greater authenticity. Drop a comment below and tell me, I choose authentic truth over comfortable lies. Because when you write those words, you're not just commenting. You're making a public declaration of your commitment to living consciously in an unconscious world. You're joining a community of people who've decided that their perception matters more than social approval. Your comment becomes a beacon for other awakened empaths who are searching for confirmation that they're not alone in this psychological awakening. Every person who reads your words will feel less isolated in their own truth-telling journey. You're literally creating the authenticity cluster that Jung described, a group of individuals committed to mutual truth rather than mutual performance. Hit that subscribe button because you've just proven that you're serious about psychological depth over entertainment fluff. You're not here for quick fixes or feel-good platitudes. You're here for the real work of understanding human consciousness at its deepest levels. Subscribing means you're choosing to receive insights that will continue challenging everything you thought you knew about relationships, society, and authentic living. When you subscribe, you're also ensuring that this type of content continues to reach people who desperately need it. Every subscription sends a message that there's an audience hungry for psychological truth, not just relationship advice or surface-level self-help. You're supporting the creation of content that actually changes lives rather than just generating views. And smash that like button because your engagement directly impacts how many other awakened empaths will discover this information. The algorithm responds to authentic engagement from people who genuinely value deep psychological content. Your like isn't just appreciation, it's activism for consciousness in a digital world designed to keep people distracted and superficial. More importantly, your like tells me that you're ready for what comes next, because what I'm preparing to share with you will make today's revelations look like the warm-up. We're going deeper into psychological territory that most content creators won't touch, because it threatens too many comfortable assumptions about human nature. The next piece of research I'm bringing you will reveal something so profound about human psychology that it will fundamentally change how you see every relationship in your life. We're going to explore a psychological pattern that's even more hidden than the awakened empath phenomenon, something that affects every person watching this video, but that virtually no one recognizes in themselves. This isn't another surface-level psychology topic. This is information that will give you X-ray vision into human behavior patterns that govern everything from workplace dynamics to romantic relationships to family systems. Once you understand what I'm about to reveal, you'll never look at social interactions the same way again. You'll finally understand why certain people drain your energy instantly while others energize you just by being present. You'll recognize the invisible psychological forces that determine who rises to leadership positions and who remains stuck in cycles of self-sabotage. Most importantly, you'll discover how to position yourself strategically in any social system to maximize your authentic influence while protecting your psychological sovereignty. Get ready, because what comes next will complete your education in the hidden psychology that governs human relationships. Everything you've learned today has been preparing you for this deeper revelation that will transform you from someone who understands empathic awakening into someone who can navigate any social system with conscious awareness and strategic authenticity. Stay tuned. You're not going to want to miss what's coming next.